Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week alternates between an episode where I unpack some scholarship and an episode where I interview one or more guests. In this week's particular episode, I'm interviewing Phil Bagge, who has been doing computer science education in the UK before it became part of the national curriculum. In our conversation today, we discuss the rise of CS in the UK, the evolution of Phil's pedagogical approach, how time constraints impact pedagogical approaches, not letting the loudest voices drive instruction, how research informs Phil's approach for working with teachers new to CS, how to emphasize student agency and teacher professional development, and so much more. There are people and organizations and curricula that Phil mentions in this particular episode, and I include links to those in the show notes, which you can find at jaredoleary.com, or by simply clicking the link in the description for the app that you're listening to this on. With all that being said, we will now begin with an introduction by Phil.
So my name's Phil Bagge, and I have quite a lot of jobs, really. Lots of different sort of variety of things I do. I teach at 2 different primary schools. I have done my best to maintain having a teaching role still. Unlike most primary school teachers, which is your elementary school in the States, I don't teach all the curriculum, I just teach the computing. Then I also work for Hampshire's Inspection and Advisory Service. So I work helping schools, running training, working with the computing managers, computing leads, persons responsible for the computing curriculum in the school, working with them, helping them to design new curricula, run lots and lots of training, CPD, continual professional development. That's really me in a nutshell, really.
Can you tell me the story of how you started teaching computer science education like in the classroom before it was actually part of a national curriculum?
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting one, really. So I was an ICT skills advisor. We actually had a job title called an advanced skills teacher. And what that means is that I taught as a primary school teacher for 4 days a week. And then I was employed to go and support other schools anywhere in my sort of area and to help them with computing. And I loved the job. It was great fun, loads of opportunities to get into schools. And I'd done lots and lots of work in my own school at really sort of raising the level of ICT, information and communication technology. And I loved it. And we'd done lots of things. We were one of the first schools to go and have a Google domain, even before there was Google Classroom. We'd rolled that out to, first of all, the teachers, then the year 6 children, that's the 10 to 11s, and then all the way down years and years before anyone else had got into all of that. I loved all of those things, but I always felt that there was a sort of a plateau where children could get to. Once you'd sort of learned every sort of Google skill, or you'd learned every word processing aspect, or how to make a good video, and all of that's got, loads of great things in it, there was nowhere else they could go. And I was sort of looking for something that would really challenge my pupils and really make them interested and give them that sort of sense of something that they could really improve, and that there was so much bigger than them that they could really sort of dig their teeth into and think, oh, I can really start with this, but I'm not going to finish it in a couple of weeks, I was looking around for something and I bumped into Computing at Schools, which was an organisation that was starting to sort of promote computing science in the classroom. So I joined that, I think about 2012, and it was just a mailing list when I joined it, from all sorts of people across the country, from lots of different perspectives. And I joined it from the sort of primary side, and I started just experimenting. I started trying all sorts of programming things with my class that I had then. I am probably the only person ever who has tried to teach Python with 7 and 8-year-olds. So I, because I didn't really know any better, I just tried all sorts of things. And little by little, I made some horrendous mistakes, one of which I've just mentioned. I sort of realised there was something really quite cool in all this and really quite exciting. And I loved some of the things that the children would be able to get into. And I loved the fact that it was just so much more open-ended, with so much more sort of knowledge and understanding that they really had no chance of plumbing the depths of in my time with them anyway. So what I did is I actually approached a whole load of head teachers, because I had this other role. I approached a whole load of head teachers and I said, how about you come and let me work for you in your school and I'll teach some computing science. Now, I've got to be honest, I think most of them didn't have a clue what I was talking about. But because I had a good reputation as somebody who would improve their ICT curriculum, they thought, So 5 of them said yes. And I ended up sort of going through all these different schools, a half day here, a day here, and teaching computing science. And lots of programming, lots of Scratch. So I'm doing this. And then, of course, just after I started this, the announcement came that ICT was going and it was going to change into computing. And so there was a new national curriculum which was written. And so everything sort of changed. But I'd sort of preempted that. I remember at one point having a video chat with about 4 people in the UK. And we were probably the only 4 people in primary who were teaching any computing science, anywhere. And 2 of them were in private school. And then there was me in Southampton in a state school. And there was another lady. That was about it, at that point. So yeah, that's sort of how I got into that sort of side.
So how did it go from like a small group of people who were engaging this into being part of the national curriculum?
Basically, I think there had been quite a lot of lobbying of the then education secretary, who was doing a big curriculum rewrite anyway. A lot of the people in the Computing at Schools sort of group lobbied and worked on, and they basically, I think, persuaded him to allow them to write a new curriculum. Now, I didn't get involved in the original writing it bit, but I did get involved in the first edit of it, which was quite exciting. And actually, whatever anybody says, it did have some primary school teachers, it did have some secondary school teachers. It wasn't just an imposed curriculum on us. I don't think we got everything right. A really exciting and interesting process. And I never thought in any of my time that I would ever be involved in taking part in editing a national document. So that was quite exciting in some ways.
What were some of the motivations behind lobbying for it? So like, I see a lot of value in computer science in general. But the typical discourse in the United States is, well, there's these unmet jobs. We need to fill this job market by training kids K through 12 now, so that way they can fill these jobs. I'm curious, is it similar in England? Like, is that part of the push for getting it in the national curriculum, or was it something completely different?
In the UK, there was a lot more made of Jeanette Wing's call to have computational thinking skills. So I think that was part of it. And then I think there was a visit by somebody quite prominent from either Google or one of the big tech firms who came over and gave a speech and basically said, look, you guys from the UK, you did a brilliant job of kicking off sort of computing in the early days. You've got the original code breakers at Bletchley Park, and you've got all that wonderful sort of starting, and you've sort of abandoned it all and you've missed out on that strand. And then there was a lot of teachers from the sort of 1980s when there was an aspect of computing science in the curriculum going, yeah, there was. And we sort of abandoned it and gone sort of Microsoft Office. I think probably a lot of people sort of saying, well, look, we've missed something. We've cut something out of our curriculum and we're at danger of missing out. I don't think really the main thing that was pushed was a jobs market. I certainly don't remember it like that anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things I'm interested in is just like the larger discourse, like how are people communicating and whatnot. But like another thing that I'm really interested in is the changes that educators or the system as a whole makes over time. And so like I have been constantly reflecting on, well, how is it that I have changed over the last number of years that I've been in education? But I'm curious from your own standpoint, like how has your own approach to pedagogy or philosophy as education changed over time, and like what led to some of those changes?
Yeah, I think in some ways I was at a little bit of a disadvantage when I first got into this because there was almost nobody anywhere doing computing science at the level of education I was doing. And so my first sort of course was to go and look at the sort of Scratch Foundation. And at that point, it seemed to mostly be saying, right, just let the children get on and do this stuff. Let's just be totally constructionist. You should just be the person who's there facilitating a bit. And now, okay, I know that's probably a little bit of caricature of what they were saying. So I tried that approach first of all. Right, let's go play with this stuff and see what we can come up with. And after about 6 months of doing that, I felt really depressed. I thought, actually, I'm not convinced any of my pupils are really making any progress. They seem to be stuck on lots of colouring in sprites, lots of very, very low-level activities. And so I thought, I've just got to try something different, really. So then I went probably the opposite. And I went very instructionist and a lot of copy coding. And then, of course, you're trying to sort of still keep that creativity in there. So you're thinking, well, okay, we're copy coding, but I've got to give children a chance to make some stuff as well, because it's no point if you're just copying it. That's boring, So did that for a while, wrote lots of work off of that, tried lots of things, found that was quite a good introductional approach. The children, learnt the sort of programming environment from that sort of things. But after about, I don't know, 18 months, 2 years of that, maybe a little bit longer, I looked at sort of what was coming out a couple of years later of the children who had just done that approach. And I was sort of equally depressed, really. I just thought, well, I've sort of gone the other way. And there are a group of children who are doing quite well from this, but it's not all of them. It's not universal. It's not equitable enough, So I felt quite depressed about that. At that point, I'd even written a book with lots of open projects in there and things. So it was quite a big sort of thing, really, for me, just to come back and think, hang on, there's got to be a better way, really. And it's probably at that point I came back and started reading a lot more computing research. And at that point, you in the States had got on board, people from Israel got on board, loads of people were sort of getting on board this. And so we're starting to see more research come out and more people writing research for novice programmers in block-based languages. So then it becomes a bit more interesting. And at that point, I'm reading loads and loads of stuff and having really sort of teach myself a lot of things as well at the same time. I mean, I was really lucky that one of my really good friends in Southampton, Professor Les Carr at Southampton University, he has just been a wonderful mentor, the type of person who's happy to sit there and explain something to an absolute idiot like myself on occasions, and that has been just brilliant. And so being able to have that time to unpick ideas, read research, I actually ended up going back to sort of use, modify, create, which I'd looked at quite a long time in the past, but I hadn't really sort of engaged with it. I thought, well, this sounds good. I'd even had a little go at it, but I'd taken it a bit too much at face value. So I'd given the children stuff, right, go use this. And then, right, let's make some changes to it. And I hadn't been very sort of guided through the process. And then, of course, one of my favorite researchers in the UK is Sue Sentence. And she came up with this sort of PRIM, which is a lovely adaptation of use, modify, create. Now, her research is all secondary pupils, which is our sort of 11-year-olds plus. But I thought to myself, hang on, this then made more sense of use, modify, create, because it made me think, actually, it's not just use, it's more investigate. And investigate can be a bit more of a guided process. It can be a little bit more, you, the teacher, think about the concepts and things you want them to come up with. You want them to really look at. So maybe you should write some questions for that and really sort of focus what they look at. And the same for the modify aspect. Maybe if we get children to really sort of focus in on the bits. So if I've taught them about count controlled loops, let's ask them to modify some count controlled loops. And then they'll learn a bit more about count controlled loops. And the lovely bit also was adding that lovely predict bit before everything, that thinking about the bigger purpose for the code. Then really, the process for me has been trying all of that. So trying a sort of strand of use, modify, create, but with a bit more structure to it. Trying to work out what's a really good way to go from pupils who modify code to pupils who can create. Because in fact, if they can't come out with agency in the programming process, what's the point? They're not going to enjoy it. You're not going to enjoy it. So how do we get them to go from that modifying bit to the creating bit? And that's been a really exciting thing, sort of making slightly harder modifications. Often with a sort of block-based programming approach, at first I would give children a whole project to make, right, go make something that uses count-controlled loops. And then thinking, well, actually, it's easy for the child to start in the original project that you made and add a whole thing into there, because that's nearer to the modification. They've got all their examples on hand. Oh, okay, that's a better first step. And then they can get into making their own, totally independent thing. It's been a sort of a real process of looking at this research and thinking, well, what's cool about it? What works? And how can I adapt this from something that was written for Python, for text-based languages? How can I adapt that into block-based languages and for my much younger children as well? And also as a computing inspector and advisor, I'm always thinking, well, that's great, but I've also got lots of teachers who are going to be teaching this who don't have the same level of knowledge that I have. So how can I write stuff into that, questions and hints and things, so that it enables them to teach this successfully? And actually, the PRIM structure really works well for that with the sort of questions, because it's a lot closer for our elementary primary teachers to a lot of the strategies they use for teaching literacy and English and maths. In fact, it fits better pedagogically for what they understand for other areas of teaching. I had a lovely training session where I went in and I did some things for the first sort of evening, and I left them with some modules of work to do. And two of the year 5 teachers, which are 9 to 10-year-olds, about a month later, I came back and they said, "Oh, Phil, this is brilliant. We went and did this with our class and they totally and utterly got it." And then really they just sold it to the rest of the school, All the other teachers who were not quite sure going, "Oh, yeah, this is cool." Because it's a lot closer to working pedagogy that they can see happening in other areas as well. The other thing that's been a big thing for me with this has been the introduction of concepts and thinking about progression as well. I realized early on that I introduced too many concepts too quickly. There was a lot of cognitive overload. So going back to things like non-computing science, things like Sweller's work on cognitive load theory, and thinking, actually, why is it children love this lesson, but the next week they can't remember half of it, And thinking, well, actually, maybe it's because I introduced too many things and I've just literally cognitively overloaded them, really. So coming back out of that and thinking, well, okay, what's a good progression? Taking some lovely stuff from your everyday computing guys who have done a great job in a really nice progression and really helped me for definites to think that through and to think about what's more complex. That has made a big difference to my curriculum, taking things I used to do in 8, 9-year-olds and thinking, actually, loops in loops, that is a really complicated one. Let's leave that to a little bit later, maybe variables too early. Let's leave that to a bit later, And I love also Suchi Grover, all her Vela stuff, all her understanding the concept away from the computer first. And we've always done quite a lot of that in primary anyway. She brought about a bit more rigor to that aspect than I'd had before. And that has also helped a lot of the teachers that we're working with because they like this idea of introducing a concept away from the programming language first. There's some nice research about the transferability of that between different programming languages as well. If you teach the concepts away from just one programming language, which I've definitely seen. Children find it easier to go from one block-based programming language to another because the concepts were taught outside of the programming language. So it's easier for them to take that and go, "Oh yeah, that's a count-controlled loop, or whatever. That's an indefinite loop. We got that. That was nothing to do with Scratch. That was just a concept we did in an algorithm somewhere, So
yeah, if people haven't heard, I did an interview with Shuchi, and it's a good interview. She's got a book that came out probably about a year ago, so can dive deeper into that. Having worked in research, but also as an educator, I know there's always more questions to ask. And I really wish there's more research on A, B, or C. I'm curious for you, what do you wish there's more research on that could inform what you do or what the teachers do that you work with?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest difficulties for me has been having to take often research that is one stage of education above where I'm at, or even sometimes 2 stages, and try and think, well, how can I get the bits out of that which would work for my elementary pupils? So a big thing for me would be to have much more elementary research into this. And we've got a lovely lady, Jane Waite, in the UK, who's done some lovely primary-based, elementary-based research into design in programming, especially with sort of block-based things. And I just think we need more of that, really. Not necessarily that bit, but more research into elementary aspects of this. Because I think we can garner things from research at a higher level, but we're always having to then do that thing where yes, that's true, but also our children have got less experience of life or of maths or of literacy. You have to do that sort of translation approach, which is not always the easiest thing. So yeah, that would be a big one for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of the research that I've been interested in have been in more informal spaces, and those informal spaces usually are with older people, but also have a range from elementary kids through adult. And because of that, it's kind of hard to sometimes translate into what would this look like in a formalized educational space. And it was fun experimenting with that, but it definitely was a lot of work trying to reconceive of something in a new venue, essentially. I enjoyed it.
In that really early stage, when I first looked at a lot of the programming research, almost none of it was in a school's context. Having run clubs for children, they're a very, very different thing to teaching, and you can get a whole load more work out of children when you're in a formal educational space because they're expecting to do that. They're expecting to work hard with this. Well, that's my experience anyway. So I think they are a different thing, really. Here's probably something a bit controversial. I just wish everybody in research would keep saying that they are following constructionist principles. Almost every single research paper you read, they say, and we're all following constructionist principles. And then you read the research and you think, oh, I don't know. You're following the constructionist principle in as much as someone's making something, which is great. And actually, I think, that's a massively valuable thing. But I do get a little bit fed up of reading that and thinking, well, you're not really following a full constructionist principles there, really. Let's be honest.
Yeah, I agree. With constructionism and a couple of other areas of research where I have dove deep in it, it's clear when some people have read the abstract and not actually read the large body of work that actually describes the thing that they're claiming to do. So yeah, I totally know what you're talking about with that. In a prior conversation, you had mentioned that I think it was on average students had about 12-hour-long sessions throughout the year. I'm curious, how the approaches that you've kind of landed on as hey, this works really well, how those are kind of match to that 12 1-hour time blocks, and if you would go with a different approach, let's say you had every single day an hour a day in the classroom.
Well, first of all, it's worth saying that we've actually got 3 times that amount of time.
Oh, okay.
But the 12 hours is really what I dedicate to the programming computing science bit.
Okay.
There's another 12 hours which most primary schools would use for more information technology, which could be anything from green screening to video making to word processing, that sort of side of things. And then there's another 12 hours that we'd mostly dedicate to online safety and thinking about how do we make good citizens. Schools are totally free to change that percentage of time and to do more of different things. I confess that on occasions I do more computing science than the other 2, but it is important to do some of the other 2 as well. And actually for our primary pupils, they do need functional skills in things as well as the understanding of computing science. And they do need to have a really good discussion, think about some of the issues around being a good citizen online and how they can avoid some of the dangers and make the most of some of the positive things. So, that's important too. So although I have a bias towards the computing science, I have to say, having taught all of them for many, many years, I think it is important that we do have a balanced curriculum that has other things in there as well. Now, your original question, though, was about, I expect, if I had more time than those 12-hour sessions. So first of all, it's worth saying not every school splits it into an hour. So for some of my schools, they have a longer slot. One of my schools, I have the equivalent of an afternoon a week, which is about a 2.5-hour slot. So schools are very different in their approach to this. I think it is true that sort of code comprehension methodologies that sort of use, modify, create, prim, those sorts of things do lend themselves quite well to picking them up, starting something, working that way through it quite independently in pairs. So it actually does work quite well on that sort of slot for so many weeks, sort of.
Yeah, I ask because I've worked in some districts where I would see the kids every single week, 30 minutes, and throughout the entire year. But then I also worked in another district where I would see the kids for 3 weeks straight every day for 40 minutes, and then I wouldn't see them again for 6 more weeks. So each approach was afforded some things, but also constrained other approaches that I could have used. So project-based learning was great for the 3-week chunk of time because every day they were coming in and working on things, but that might not have worked as well when I only saw them 30 minutes for a little bit. But they all kind of have their pros and cons. So I was just curious if it would change for you.
Okay, so it's worth saying I tend to use the code comprehension stuff for the programming that we're doing, which is mostly screen-based. If I'm doing projects that involve design and technology, that involve things like the Crumble control board, we do an independent electronics project, we do a Robot Wars project, and those tend to have a different structure to them. It's a lot more difficult to do code comprehension with those sorts of things. And in some ways, I use the screen-based stuff to really sort of make sure children really understand that. And then when you get into doing the projects which involve building things as well, that you're not having to teach so much of that. And you are much more doing a sort of a creative project, a project-based learning approach. That is a different thing. And I have tried a bit of code comprehension with that side of things, and it sort of works. I wouldn't have said that was the best thing for that. I'm still trying to work out the optimal strategy for that sort of programming experience, really.
Now, the way you're describing this, it sounds like it's almost like a set time or a set class that students go to separate from like their, I don't know if you call it like a homeroom teacher, or is that accurate?
It is for me in my schools that I teach in, but in most primary schools that wouldn't be. In most primary schools, computing would be, like every other subject, would be taught by the class teacher, your homeroom teacher, or wouldn't be a specialist. So there are schools that do employ specialists to do it, but the majority would be the class teacher. So of course, anything you do has to work for somebody who's a non-specialist, really.
So with that being said, like in the States, like when it is just like a general classroom teacher, they're often trying to find ways to integrate with another subject area. It's not learning computer science for the sake of learning computer science or computational thinking. It's trying to find a way, okay, yeah, we value that, but we really need to improve our math scores. So is there a way that we can do both at the same time? Is that also something that teachers in the UK deal with? Or is it like a separate, no, we learn computer science for the sake of learning computer science?
It's interesting that, because left over from our old ICT curriculum was this idea of the best way to teach ICT was to integrate it into other areas. So a lot of people took that when they went from ICT to computing, they took that approach and went, oh yes, we previously, if we were going to do word processing, we might do that with a literacy fill or with a history project. And actually, there's a lot of brilliant stuff that integrates really well from that. One of the things that I've argued very much for, though, is to look at computing science in a different way. So I would say that information technology and that is a servant to the rest of the curriculum, because in a way it's not really its own subject. It's how to use lots of stuff to work our way through the digital world. Whereas what I've argued quite heavily in the UK is that actually computing science is its own subject.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean that it's not going to have impetus and topic and things that you're going to be exciting, which will link to other areas. But it's not a servant to maths. It's not a servant to history. If those things coincide in a great way, go for it. There was the Scratch Maths project, which was a big UK thing, and that looked at whether learning math skills using Scratch would improve your math skills. Actually, although it found that it would improve the computational thinking skills of children, it didn't actually found that it massively improved their math skills, really. Personally, I think it's much better to teach the computing science for its own sake, because it's a really interesting, exciting subject in its own right. I think that is respectful to computing science. And that doesn't mean you won't end up touching other things. I mean, I do a lovely project around Cartesian coordinates because it fits really well and it's a lovely maths link. And I do think it makes a difference to their enjoyment and excitement of using those.
Yeah, that makes sense. And from like an educational psychology perspective, I worry when we focus so much on integration in the States that it gets rid of the joy of being able to create through computer science and just like exploring the medium. And it kind of turns it into basically like a digital equivalent of a worksheet. So like, yeah, you're coding, but you're just coding to solve like predetermined answers rather than to like create something or solve like problems that have open-ended solutions. So that's kind of like my fear with some of the way that I've seen integration happen.
I'm a big believer in it's nice if you can find a link, but I think often the thing that loses out most when people stretch those links and make them fit is the computing science. And I don't think that's fair to the subject.
Yep.
What I would say, though, is that we should look for a variety of genre in this. It shouldn't all be gaming. It shouldn't all be math stuff. Typically for the primary, I think the stuff that does some shape drawing type stuff is great. Logo was the one that led the way in that, We can definitely do some great stuff in Scratch or other block-based programming languages. Gaming, definitely making some games is a great thing, and children can put a great stamp of interest in what they love on that, And I think some app making, for me, covers lots and lots of other sort of things you might make, everything from a fish tank to something that adds up some numbers so I'm a big one for believing that we should never think that children like certain things. And we should also be really careful in the classroom for being driven by what the noisiest children say. I have a little story. So I remember teaching a computing science thing, which was about how we could use computing science to do some basic maths problems and how we could use variables and all the rest of it. And there were some quite noisy boys in that lesson who had sort of, in no uncertain terms, they'd done the work, but they'd let me know that it wasn't really anywhere near as exciting as the gaming project we'd done previously. And I was just walking away from this project, feeling sort of, okay, I think that worked. They did what I wanted them to do, but I was just coming around the corner and there were these 5 girls and they rushed up to their class teacher, who they'd got a better relationship with because she teaches them all the time. And they say, oh, miss, that was a brilliant session. We really enjoyed that. It's really interesting. And I thought, Phil, you must not judge it just by the noisiest kids in the class. It actually made me think, I've just got to make those genres available to all the children. As long as we've got a balance of stuff, that's great. And they will find the things they enjoy and they'll put up with doing the other things because they're still learning some stuff,
Yeah, that was definitely something that I tried to do when I was in the classroom, and then with the curriculum that I currently create, like just constantly trying to find that balance between like stories and like design and games and apps, like so that way it's not just like one thing. Because while I might love a game-based curriculum, some kid might hate it.
Last year, in both of my year 5 and 6 classes, the best games were made by my girls, easily. Really, really well produced. So I don't believe we should think this thing, it's all the boys who love the games. That's rubbish. I just think we should just have this open thing, which is let's give them a wide variety of genres and let them find the things they like in that. Second guess it either, because we'll probably be wrong.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I'm curious, like through all these different approaches that you've tried over the years and like with the research, how has that kind of informed your own approach when working with teachers who are new to teaching computing in their classrooms?
I think it's interesting. There are things I still use. So even from that original instructional thing, say we're doing a session of CPD on introducing to Scratch. So I will often do a very instructionist 20 minutes because in some ways people need to see some stuff early on. Same with my pupils. In fact, most of them can't do code comprehension type methodologies if they don't understand the basics of the environment. So there is a place for some of that, which I think is still useful. But I also want my students and my teachers to work harder than me. And actually, if the only approach is instruction, I'm probably working harder than them. Whereas actually, when I get them to start thinking for themselves a little bit more, funneling them into trying some of those things, I also am a big believer in sort of paired work, even for some of the sort of prim stuff and for teachers as well. I'll say, look, I want you to pair up with somebody else who's about the same. So if you've never done any of this, choose someone who's never done any of this. Don't go and find the one person who's done it all, because that is not going to help you. They will do all the work for you. You'll sit back and, so find someone who's about the same level as you. And then you'll struggle together. You've got to know that I'm a big believer that we're all going to make bugs in this, that bugs are totally normal. Don't be worried about it. I won't be funny with you. I'll be totally cool if you get stuff wrong. I get stuff wrong in front of the children sometimes. It's totally normal. It's going to be normal for you in the classroom as well. That actually is a liberating thing for a lot of teachers because they're used to other curriculum areas where, if you write the wrong spelling of something on there and someone comes in, it's like, and here we're saying, well, actually, you are going to do the wrong coding sometimes. It's just, even Professor Les Carr from Southampton University is coping with bugs on a daily basis. And that's probably quite a liberating thing for a lot of primary school teachers when they hear that, think, okay, all right, so I can start then. It's not the end of the world if I make some mistakes, The other thing, I'm a big one when I'm working with other teachers, it's really just talking about some of the ways that children avoid learning. So I'll often talk about learnt helplessness, how children will try and get you as the teacher or the child sitting next to them to do the work for them. And then we look at strategies that can help teachers to get children around from that. Now, secretly, I'm doing 2 things. Yes, I'm helping them with real strategies that work really well in the classroom, but I'm also challenging their own learnt helplessness, because actually there is in almost every elementary primary school, there are teachers who rely on other people to do their technology for them. And that's not a helpful thing for them. When I've done sessions with this, I always remember doing a really big session with 4 schools, and the lead head teacher for a whole group of about 25 academy schools, she came up after the first session when I talked about learnt helplessness, and she said, I've got to be honest with you, I have been really learnt helpless in the past. And she said, and I'm going to stop doing that now. And I tell you something, the impact I had, honestly, the amount of work that everybody else put in, because she was leading from example, really, by recognizing that. And you could see that at school, well, we better take this seriously and do it if she thinks that, So that's another big approach, which I think is really important. And also, I think it's really important to just put computing, because a lot of people in the UK would not have had a computing background in their own education. So they wouldn't have had a computing science bit because it hasn't really been in our education system for a long time. For me, a lot of that is about framing and saying, well, actually, what we're doing is the gatekeepers to a whole set of knowledge. And that actually, if we leave that bit of knowledge out of children's curriculum, then that's another gate that a lot of them will never push on. So really, you're restricting their opportunities in work, in university, in the future. And then also talking about how much computing, although you might not become a programmer, how much an understanding computing can be interesting for lots of other sciences and for all sorts of other areas of development. So I think, don't just think about it as you're opening up programming, you're opening up children's eyes to how a lot of the world works. And that might be useful for them later on when they go and do other things as well. And if you don't open that door, a lot of them will never push it themselves. And actually, primary school teachers are pretty cool at wanting to give opportunity.
Yeah.
And actually often find they rise to that occasion.
You've mentioned it a little bit, but I'm curious, how do you encourage teachers to do this in a way that emphasizes agency with kids?
So whatever strategy you're choosing, whatever sort of pedagogy, I think it's important to have an agreement with your pupils that actually they are going to get some create time in there. Say I'm using something like the code comprehension methodologies. What that's been great is great for enabling me to actually support those children who need the support the most. So typically 2/3 of my children can get on with that pretty independently and with a partner. They can do it, they can mark it, then they can go on to the next sections, they can do it themselves. But that's then freed me up to work with those children who need me to read stuff, who might need me to scribe a question because their writing's not so fast. What's been absolutely wonderful out of this has been seeing those children who in previous lessons I might not even notice that they'd actually not done much, now really giving them the time. So my whole focus and time is then taken up really with helping them, because the rest of the children are getting on and doing it pretty independently, and that has been absolutely lovely. I mean, I've had children where the class teacher has said to me, well, so-and-so and so-and-so, I really can't get them to do anything. And then we've had some sessions, and because I've read the questions to them and then they've played it and worked it out and puzzled it out. And then sometimes I've said, oh, what do you think? What's the answer? Oh, yeah, write this, Mr. Bagge. And they've got the questions right. They've got the answer right. They've tested stuff themselves. They've done it themselves. Sometimes just seeing their look on their faces of realizing that they're in a total mainstream lesson and they've achieved just as highly as all the rest of the children there is just wonderful.
Yeah.
And then the other thing, part of the agreement really, if a child is really working hard with that, maybe engaging with me with reading those or having a real good go if they're struggling, after a certain period of time, if I feel they've really worked hard, I will just go and cross a couple of questions off the end of their to-do list to get them on to the next section, to make sure they get at least 1/3 of that lesson, if not more, to actually make something. Because there's nothing worse, not having that create time and that personal agency, really. Children pick up if you're fair, whether you're fair in how you are with the class, your discipline structures, your relationships. So really protecting those bits of the curriculum and making sure that they have full access to every bit of it, which includes that create time, goes down very well with them. And I think I get more effort out of them because they know I'm going to make sure they get some time to make some stuff,
One of my critiques that I've seen with some people who focus on computational thinking or even computer science is they do it for the sake of understanding but not applying. And so they don't actually create things with it. I've always had a problem with that. Like having a background in music education, like when I was getting my degrees, I had to take music theory courses. And music theory courses, you're analyzing music for the sake of analyzing music. You don't actually compose anything. You don't create anything new. You're just looking at what somebody else created and went, oh, this might be what they thought of, but it's probably not it. And so there's no application of the understanding of it. It's not that there's not value in it. It's just what's the point of learning this thing if I can't do something with it and I can't create my own music or my own program or whatever?
No, I totally and utterly agree with you. Actually, I think it was Diane Levitt. I did a session in New York on agency. Although I'd always had this idea of agency before, I think it was her who gave me that first word. When I was trying to learn some programming, just having a list of this does this and this does this and this does this, I can read it through. I can have a quick go at those things. After a while, I lose the will to live. And so actually it's so important to do something with it. And I think any methodology that you choose, it's important that it has some form of creation in it. I personally don't think that stops at primary. I think that should go through all of computing science education.
Yeah.
My friend Les Carr will tell me, right, so his students are off to make this web app that fits with this sort of aspect of much, much more complex programming. And I think, well, yeah, so you're still having that agency and that creation and that GUI design and that, as part of your project. So, yeah, I'm a big one for thinking that's important.
What do you think is like preventing educators from doing as well as they would like to in the classroom or with computer science? Like as an example, in the States, all these standardized tests, that takes the focus, and anything that takes time away from that is considered to be like less than. So computer science is often put on the back burner as like, well, no, I need to focus on preparing students for this particular test. So like that's how I might respond. Like, well, maybe we shouldn't really focus on tests as much.
So in the UK, because the computing science is part of the national curriculum, state schools have to actually teach it. Now, that doesn't mean they have to teach it in the way I think they should teach it. They can choose whatever they like. So that is a real plus. So you've already got this sort of starting position. That definitely helps. You've got a sort of common set of aims. And what we found in our school inspection system, previous to the last sort of 10 years or so, or 5 years really, the inspection system's been focused very heavily on maths and literacy. So you're right. And then what happens is teachers, because the inspection system is focused on that in primary, then teachers squeeze all and the systems and heads squeeze all of the other bits of curriculum and to do more maths and literacy because that's what you're being judged on. So we do have that. We have a situation, though, about 2 years ago, really, where the chief inspector for schools recognised that actually the other aspects of education were being squeezed and started to tweak the inspection system to asking questions about the wider curriculum. And actually, that's been really useful for us because it's enabled us to encourage schools to take geography and history and art and music and computing a bit more seriously. We do have a bit of a strange system, though, because our academy schools don't have to do quite the same national curriculum focus. And we do still see some schools squeezing that. The best schools do recognise, I think, that actually children want a variety of things. Personally, I do feel our key stage 3, which is our 11 to sort of 15, has gone a bit too focused on the exam testing regime. We did have for quite a while a bit of a programming project that got you points towards your exam, or you could do that. And then that was taken out in favour of a sort of a more exam based. And personally, I think that was a mistake.
Like, would you say it's a time thing as well? Like, oh, we only have a limited number of time. If only we had double the amount of time, like we could get so much more done.
One of the things we find in the UK is the primary schools, the elementary schools, if they feel that their maths and their literacy is at a good enough standard to get through, inspections and all the rest of it, then you find that their focus goes on to the wider curriculum and improving that. Now, that's lovely because they then come and work with people like me. But in some ways, that upsets me a little bit because it's all those children who maybe aren't in a school who have got to that standard, who are often the ones who are not asking for help, not getting any support. Now, don't get me wrong, I do understand the importance of writing and reading and the importance of that. But actually, I think a broader education, that should be valid for everybody. I mean, I've been doing a bit of work with Teach First, and I've been quite impressed with the fact that they try and place teachers in the most difficult areas, really, or the areas that have more social deprivation. They're trying to push this sort of wider curriculum thing as much as they can.
If you were to like wave a magic wand and either fix something related to what you're just talking about or have it so that all teachers across the UK were to be able to understand something like a concept, philosophy, whatever, like what would you wish for and why?
I just wish that every school would engage with open-ended programming languages directly rather than any sort of rote learning or very heavily scripted computerized type thing. I believe in the messiness of programming and the making mistakes for it and having agency over stuff. And I'd much prefer schools who were willing to get their feet dirty with Scratch or the Crumble programming language or the Microbit or Python or whatever, rather than going down a very heavily scripted, computerized scheme for that.
Some of the language and platforms that you just mentioned are like block-based. Some of them are text-based. I'm curious where you stand in there's that debate that goes on with when should you transition, or is it okay to just do like GUI or block-based like all the way through like K-12?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one. See, our national curriculum says that you must use at least one text-based language in our key stage 3 and 4, which is from 11-year-old up. That doesn't mean that teachers straight away from 11 go, right, okay, let's throw out all text-based, let's throw out all block-based programming languages. But it does mean that there will be a transition at some point. And probably the most popular in secondary is Python, really. Now, I've taught Python quite successfully in primary as well, and I really enjoyed teaching it. In fact, I felt the children really enjoyed it. We got something out of it. The only reason I really moved away from it is not because I didn't like it. It was because I felt that in lots of ways it was a real hard ask to take a non-specialist teacher and actually train them in the use of it in a short space of time. Whereas actually I felt the block-based programming language, I could do that. So it wasn't so much that I had any great philosophy behind that. There's some interesting sort of approaches to try and think about transitioning. I do like things that, is it pencil code that has that ability to flick between the block-based and the text-based? And there's a few other programming languages that have sort of experimented with that sort of thing. And I think that's useful. I do also think that that whole idea of introducing the main concepts away from programming is massively useful as well. Because, at the point where we get to something else and we go, well, that's still a count-controlled loop. That's still an indefinite loop. It looks different. It doesn't work exactly the same way as Scratch, but actually it is. I think that introducing concepts away from computing sort of helps. Whether I'm really clear on when the best time to transition, maybe at the point where the children's typing and writing skills are good enough to cope with more typing and writing. That must be part of it. And the ability to spot very small syntax errors.
Yeah, that makes sense. My kids did block-based up through 3rd grade, and then from 4th grade on, they had the choice of continuing with Scratch, or they could do Ruby or JavaScript or Swift. And the kids who did make that transition, even as early as 4th grade, they made all of these like leaps that I knew were not in the platform that they were using. Like it didn't teach them how to do that. And when I'd ask them, well, how did you figure that out? They're like, oh, well, I figured like, here's how I'd do it in Scratch. And then I just imagine what I do in JavaScript. And I was like, that's it. That's what you're supposed to do.
It's interesting you say that because when I was doing both, I had some children describe that same process. And one of them actually said I would go and prototype it in Scratch. And if I could do it in Scratch, I knew I could then go and write it in Python.
Yep. How do you practice or iterate on your own abilities? So you've done a lot of different pedagogical approaches and you've worked in different positions, like either working with students or working with teachers, but how do you personally try and improve or refine that?
Yeah, so probably a really key thing for me has been the relationship I have with Les Carr from Southampton University, to the point of actually doing some programming together, learning some bits. If I get to the point where I think, actually, I really do want to get this thing, I will often go and have a chat, a conversation, or a bit of a session learning some things. The other place is we have an organization called Computing at Schools, CAS. And there's lots of great people on that you can go and work with. Lots of forums that you can discuss stuff or put stuff off on, say, what's a great place for improving your skills in so and so. And then at the moment, we've got the National Centre for Computing Education that's been around for a couple of years now. And they are developing some really good courses to further your knowledge and to understand other aspects of things. My difficulty is I often really love all that much more advanced stuff, but how much time do I have to do that In some ways, if it was left to me and I didn't have to actually teach it in primary and write resources and author books and all sorts of stuff, then I'd probably be sitting there with a microbit trying to work out what the next thing I can do. I've had to be quite sort of constrained. Ultimately, I'm a teacher. If my pupils aren't getting the very best out of their computing science at the age they are and being able to take some quality skills and understanding and agency up to the next step, then I've not really done my job, really. So
while you were mentioning that, I was just thinking of something. So I'm curious what your perspective is on this. One of the things that I really appreciated when working with students is I knew long term where they were headed if they were to head down a particular path, maybe several years. So like having done app development, all these things that they might not currently be working on, but if they had a question, I was able to guide them that would assist them further down the road. But also having done professional development with teachers, I know they don't have the time to learn several programming languages and IDEs and platforms, etc., like I have. So they're going to learn the basics of what they need to be able to teach at that grade level, but they don't necessarily know where it's heading several years down the road. And I'm curious what your thoughts are with that. Like, how has that helped you when working with young elementary kids, even though you're working on this really advanced thing and you know that they're never going to do that with 5-year-olds? Do you feel like that has helped prepare you for working with those kids and teachers?
I think certainly the discussions on the bigger things about how computing work have always been useful, even if it's sometimes to decide that you don't do those because actually they're not cognitively at the level that there's enough abstraction understanding to really make sense of that. But even that can be a really good thing because that in itself is a decision about what to include and what to not include. In my very earliest computing science teaching, I was a sort of whoa, I've learned some new thing, let's just go throw it out there. Which is good from a trying stuff perspective, but it's also major league cognitive overload on occasion for some children.
Right.
So in terms of seeing where it's going in the future and what the possibilities are, I think, to be fair, I see more of my secondary colleagues picking up children and giving them a bigger perspective as to where those things are in the future. I think my job as an elementary teacher is more about, can I get you to secondary with enough excitement and enthusiasm and enough knowledge to make some stuff that you go into your computing lessons as an 11-year-old in secondary going, oh, bring it on, I'm ready for this. So if they go in with that, and then their teachers will start sharing all this wider stuff around, because mostly in our secondary schools, they're being taught by a computing specialist who will have a bit more understanding. Now, I could do that, some of it. And I have had primary school pupils who've come back many years later and said, actually, Mr. Bagge, I got a job in programming and it was your set of lessons when we were in year 5, 9 to 10-year-olds that triggered it all off.
Yeah.
So that does happen. But I also think you don't want to heavily force a child into a pathway.
Totally agree.
Too early. You want to keep it exciting. But if they get excited about science instead and go off on a chemistry thing, great. And hopefully some of that computation will be useful in some of their science as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. When I was in a K6 school, so that was like 5-year-olds through 11 or 12-year-olds, my goal was to just get kids excited about the subject. Like, I just wanted them to have fun creating. But the most recent district that I was in, it was K8. So it was like 5-year-olds through like early teenagers. So I had that opportunity not only get them excited, but also like, okay, now we can dive even deeper into it. So yeah, your answer definitely makes sense to me.
I have had children at the age of 10 and 11 come up to me and say, Mr. Bagge, how do I get a job in computing? So I think you have to be ready for some of those questions. And actually, I talked to them about developing their programming. But I also said, look, you're going to need some maths as well. So don't dump your maths curriculum, because that's going to be useful for you.
In the United States, like, there's a high burnout rate. Like, I think it's like 50% of teachers leave within the first 3 to 5 years, something like that. I don't recall the exact stats, but it's really high like that. How do you personally try and like prevent that kind of burnout? Because with computer science in particular, like, you never stop learning. So that might be motivating for some people, but it could also be like, okay, well, what I learned a year ago, now I got to learn something brand new. And like it never ends.
It does never end in as much as we're always inventing better ways of doing it. But actually, I've often presented to primary school teachers and said, well, it's true that information technology is always changing. And, what will be the next big thing after the iPad or the touchscreen? That is always true. But actually, the fundamental building blocks of the programming languages, even going back to Ada Lovelace, there will be a recognition of some aspects of that programming language, even all the way back to then. So there's a constancy in computing science at the moment. I do think the whole AI thing may change that a little bit more, but there's a bit of a constancy. Or at the point where someone develops something that can do not just a 0 and a 1, but a 0, 1 and a 2 at the same time, So at that point, we get into a whole different thing. But at the moment, I'm often surprised when I'm doing training that I will get someone who's a lot older come and say, oh, well, I did some logo or some Fortran or something way back. And actually, Phil, all the concepts you're talking about, I learned about then. And I say, oh, brilliant. Exactly. So there was something that was constant from your previous training that you can take in. And yes, we've got more exciting, interesting ways of doing it, but hey, well done. You've got some transferable skills.
What about for teachers who might not have the time? Like if they're a general classroom teacher and they're teaching the computer science stuff basically on the side, like it's not their main gig. How about for them? How would you recommend that they continue to learn while also not overwhelming themselves with always having to stay up to date?
In most of our primary schools, we often have a computing lead, and it's that person's job to actually keep abreast of the curriculum and keep the other teachers updated. Now, when that's working well, that means that person should be, typically in the UK, going along to the local community groups that we organise maybe once a term, picking up new ideas, new methodologies, new things to think about, and taking it back and thinking, well, how do I disseminate those things? Do I do 10 minutes in a staff meeting? Do I lead something? A good computing lead is worth promoting and helping and nurturing. And I expect a lot of our job really is trying to get those people into groups of communities of practice and then encourage them, present them with training opportunities, those sorts of things, and then encourage them to take that back into their schools. So I think that's important. Burnout is something that happens for all teachers. And I do massively worry at the moment in the UK for the head teachers. I have never seen so much workload put on them by COVID regulations and all sorts of other things. I very much fear for our education system in the next couple of years because I think we're going to lose a lot of head teachers, and experienced head teachers are really valuable and can make a big difference. And I wonder whether we might lose some teachers in that as well.
So before we started recording, we were just kind of talking a little bit about COVID, and you were mentioning that there were some like equity issues around like just a lack of devices for kids or even like internet. I'm curious, like thinking not necessarily just on the device front, but just broadly with equity and inclusion, like how have educators or organizations like try to improve in equity and inclusion in relation to computer science? And it doesn't need to be just framed in COVID, like it could be before that as well.
There's a lovely group called CAS Include that have been really sort of championing inclusion. They've been doing lots of events and things and pushing that side of things and encouraging us all to sort of think about that side of aspects. And then I think it's the job of people like me to take some of that back and disseminate it. So even in my own practice, I think it's important to think about what are you doing in terms of equity in different areas? For example, I went to a session, 7 years ago on basically sexism. And they said to me, well, male teachers often will challenge their male students and do the work for their female students. And I thought, oh God, there's no way I would ever do something like that. I'm a modern bloke, And I went back and was running a code club that evening. And there was a group of lads who were making a game and they were stuck on something. And I said, just going to say, here's a hint. And then I walked off and left them. And there were two girls who were making a unicorn game. And they said, Mr. Bagge, how did it? And I went and took over and did it for them. And I thought, oh my goodness. I have professed that sexism is wrong and all the rest of it. And here am I just perpetuating this. So I think it is important that we do have groups that raise these issues and say it. And then I think it's really important that as we as educators and we as who are responsible for training sort of run those things past and sort of check out. I think sometimes we have this big S sexist or big R racist thing, and yet all of us are capable of small racist things, and actually checking our practice constantly is important, and thinking, so have I not helped those two Indian kids because I think I've got this viewpoint that they should be good at technology anyway? So there's a whole load of sort of minor racist stereotypes that we all have to some extent, and challenging our own, and then just being honest and saying, look, I have to keep challenging myself because I was born in 1967. I'm not going to be totally there yet. So I think those aspects are important. I think also there's been some really nice work around trying to help pupils see people from their same background or their same sex who have done really well. So there's been a lot of work put into representation in terms, especially female computing scientists, which has been a big issue in schools. There's lots of sort of posters and things and promoting. And it's been nice in the UK to see a lot more. If you go to a computing conference, you'll see a much more diverse set of people presenting than you might have done 10 years ago. And I think that's really good. I don't think we're there. I think, our government brought out a thing quite recently, in effect, pretending that there was no institutionalized racism and everything was great in the UK. And I personally think that until we've really got an equal playing field for everybody, then that can't actually be true. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done on this.
If you think of like a listener to this podcast who might be able to help you with something, like what is something that you are working on that you might need some help with?
So one of the things, I write a lot of computing science resources, and I've often looked for, and maybe this is not so much a computing science question really some ways, but what is the best way to ask questions of younger children? I would be really interested if anybody's got any educational or computing science research into the best method of putting a written question down. Now, at the moment, I tend to write a question and I try it out with about 3 classes, and I think, oh God, that was an awful question, or no, I might go and rewrite it and try it again. But there must be a better science behind that. So if there's anybody out there who knows anything along those lines, I'd be really interested.
One of the things that we've talked about internally at Boot Up is a math process for asking questions called cognitive guided inquiry. And so that has some really good questions that are math related, but very easily can transfer over to thinking like an algorithm in math with an algorithm in computer science and whatnot. But then there's also another podcast that I did on like open, guided, and closed questions and like those kind of broad questions. I'll make sure to send that to you. So I'm writing myself a note.
No, that's lovely. Thank you. I look forward to listening to them.
Do you have any questions for myself or for the field?
I'm particularly interested in what the best educational research combined with the best sort of computing science research. So I think we're still a very, very young subject, especially at this age. And I think we're going to go through a whole sort of, when we think of where maths teaching and learning has come, and that's probably taken them hundreds of years to get here. And actually, we're really, really early on this sort of journey.
Yep.
I've been really excited. I'm writing some new resources and some new books, and I've agreed with the authors that we're not really making much money out of the books, but we've agreed to put all the money that comes from those books back into editing them and improving them and taking them on and doing rewrites of them. And that, I think, is really important, because actually we will have some great insights, but there will be things we learn in the next few years which will be great to put in. And I think that's probably what excites me most about this process, that it is a process of change and development and improvement. And I'm just really pleased that I've had a chance to be in on the ground floor in this tiny little bit in the UK with the elementary side of, primary side of teaching. So
that's an interesting point about having to like update the books. Basically, like I was on a team that helped write the standards for computer science in the state of Wyoming, and they typically have a cycle of like 10 to 12 years or something like that. They go back and revise the standards and then update them to something new. And when we all met, we're like, you're probably going to want to cut that in half at least, like, because in 5 years, things are going to change.
No, that's true. The other thing I suppose I'm probably really interested in is this combination of working with researchers, but also working with teachers as well. I think it's really important to sort of keep the two sides of these things closely sort of connected. And that's probably why I've always appreciated those researchers who have made the time to include teachers in their wider circle, because I think it's not just a research-based thing, it has to actually be taught. And probably my greatest compliment ever was up at Southampton University and meeting, I don't know, about 3 or 4 professors, and one of them saying, actually, I had a look at your work on variables that you'd published around some text-based stuff we were doing at the time. And I really liked it. And I even adjusted some of that for teaching my university students. And I thought, oh my goodness, one, what a lovely person to actually come back and say that to you. And two, the fact that actually someone's can learn enough to recognize that, you can learn even from something, and when something's been distilled at a lower level, a more basic level, and that there was value in that.
Yeah, that's a nice compliment. So then I guess my last question would be, where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
Yeah, so I have a website which is Code-IT, which is code-it.co.uk, of which I publish free programming stuff on there and sorts of other bits and pieces. My email address is on there. As a Hampshire computing inspector, Hampshire will sell me out anywhere. In fact, I have been all over the world at some point in time and doing stuff. If any of your listeners want to work with me, then they're very welcome to send us an email and we can discuss things.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. I really hope you enjoyed this interview with Phil. I know I certainly did. And I hope you consider sharing this with others. Stay tuned next week for another Unpacking Scholarship episode, and 2 weeks from now for another interview. Hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.